G'day, I'm Dr. Paul Mason, and today we're going to be talking about concussion. Now, there's long been debate about whether concussion represents a structural injury to the brain or rather just represents a transient disturbance of function from which one will ultimately recover. And the answer is both, sort of. You see, these things are not entirely mutually exclusive. There's both an initial structural injury and concussion and a functional disturbance, which, if left unchecked, can lead to further structural injury. And it's this last point, that the functional disturbance can result in further structural injury, which shows the most promise for meaningful intervention in concussion and other brain injury. That concussion, which is a form of mild traumatic brain injury, causes structural damage is obvious. Using imaging techniques that can visualise the long fibre tracks within the brain, it's readily appreciated that concussed brains are structurally damaged. And not all of this damage, as I said, comes from the initial trauma, but there's a second wave of damage that I submit is able to be reduced with healthier diets, nutrition, so on and so forth. Essentially, this second wave of damage occurs because there's a functional energy deficiency, and that functional energy deficiency results in failure of cellular processes which are needed to maintain cellular survival. Structural damage aside, concussed brains simply don't work the same, and it's because of this starvation of energy. So we commonly call this an energy crisis. Regions of the brain are simply unable to access glucose, which they usually use for energy. Here, the bright colours indicate areas of a brain which are no longer able to use glucose for energy. And in the absence of this energy supply, these regions of the brain simply cease to function normally. And recovery of this function can take far longer than the commonly cited 7 to 10 days. There's an imaging technique called magnetoencephalography, and that measures magnetic fields produced by the electrical impulses of normal brain activity. This is quite distinct from the normal magnetic resonance imaging, which creates its own magnetic field. And this magnetoencephalography can detect something called delta waves, which are the slowest frequency brain waves, which are usually associated with either deep sleep or unconsciousness, which makes their presence in concussed brains in adolescents who have had concussion quite concerning, even after seasons end and following a single concussion. The question is, what actually is the root cause of this functional brain disturbance? What causes this inability to use glucose for energy? Now, many neurons can take up glucose freely using a transporter or a passage called GLUT3. If glucose is there, they can use it. Now, other brain neurons lack this GLUT3 transporter. Instead, they have a transporter that requires the action of insulin to work. And without insulin being both present and functioning normally, these neurons can't take up glucose. In effect, these neurons are starved of glucose, even in a land of plenty. And it's these neurons which are most vulnerable to concussion injury, the second wave. In medical school, I was taught an outdated model of cellular structure, where the surrounding membrane of cells was considered to be a largely uniform layer, randomly studded with proteins. In reality, however, the cell membrane is not homogeneous, but rather contains regions or lakes known as lipid rafts. And these regions are especially rich in cholesterol. They contain about 5 times more cholesterol than the surrounding cell membrane. And these lipid rafts house and protect several different types of proteins, including several proteins necessary for insulin function. That is, damage to the lipid raft can impair insulin signaling and prevent neurons from using glucose for energy. This is cellular prion protein, which is anchored to the lipid raft. And it's interesting in that it can provide both evidence of damage to the lipid rafts as well as brain injury. You see, concussive forces can dislodge it from the lipid raft and release it into the blood. An increase in cellular prion protein in the blood indicates both concussion and lipid raft disturbance, which is why blood levels of cellular prion protein are now considered to be a reliable marker for neuronal or brain injury. Of course, cellular prion protein is not the only protein associated with lipid rafts. There are several others co-located, including flotillin and CBL-associated protein, or CAP for short, which importantly are essential for insulin signalling. That is, disruption of these other proteins will block the action of insulin and prevent those cells from using glucose for energy. This study, which obviously cannot be performed in humans, provides molecular level evidence of this. A 95-gram weight was dropped from a height of 1 metre onto the right side of the temporal region of anaesthetised mice. They did it either 1 or 3 times. And predictably, this resulted in increases in the blood levels of cellular prion protein, which, as with concussed humans, is associated with an impairment in the ability of the brain to use glucose, even weeks later. The most significant finding of this study, however, came after the mice were subsequently sacrificed and their brains examined. Now, there are 5 lipid raft proteins that were examined in this study, including cellular prion protein, flotillin, and CAP. And they were found to be markedly reduced in the brains of these mice, even after just 1 impact. And after 3 impacts, they were completely undetected. Clear evidence that concussion disrupts the lipid raft and the associated proteins which are necessary for insulin signalling. Now, the regional variation of brain injury, where some brain areas are particularly susceptible to injury, they're disproportionately affected, is consistent with the insulin receptor distribution throughout the brain. It's well known, for example, that the memory centre of the brain, the hippocampus, is particularly vulnerable to concussion. Atrophy or shrinking of the hippocampus being observed even in young athletes with a concussion history. It's therefore no coincidence that in the hippocampus there is a particularly high density of lipid raft embedded insulin receptors. Now, one of the direct consequences of impaired utilisation of glucose by neurons is the failure of what we call ion pumps, which help to regulate fluid balance across cells. Accordingly, insulin resistance, even outside of concussion, results in failure or impairment of these ion pumps. If only there was a way to provide these neurons with energy that didn't rely on a functioning insulin receptor. First of all, I just need to address the elephant in the room. The claim that we need to consume 130 grams a day of dietary carbohydrate to fuel our brain. This was widely promoted, formalised and publicised in a 2002 report by the Institute of Medicine. It was based on the amount of glucose on average that could, not needed to be, but could be metabolised by the brain, which was about 100 grams. And then another 30 grams was added for what I consider to be a fudge factor. The problem is that the ability of the brain to use glucose should not be considered as a need. Enter ketones, which are not only able to provide neurons with energy, but they don't require a functioning insulin receptor. Ketones are a group of compounds that tend to be produced from fatty acid metabolism in a low insulin state, which in effect requires a low carbohydrate diet. That the brain is able to use ketones for energy was clearly demonstrated by the pioneering metabolic researcher George Cahill. The same George Cahill who stated, and I quote, "Many studies suggest human brain cells can survive with little to no glucose." He then added, "But proving the point is difficult, as well as experimentally difficult and ethically questionable." A statement that perhaps needs to take on more meaning when you consider that he performed the following study. 3 subjects who had been fasted for several weeks were infused with 20 units of insulin over a 24-hour period, which is represented in the shaded area. Predictably, this resulted in a significant drop in glucose levels, shown here in red, to less than 1.5 millimoles a litre, which is a level that would see most diabetics in a coma. Cahill, in fact, describes one subject going as low as 1 millimole a litre. The thing is, these 3 subjects remained completely asymptomatic, free of any symptom of low glucose. The already high rate of ketone usage, due to them effectively being starved, was able to be increased even more, providing the brain with all the energy it needed. Observe the corresponding drop in ketone levels at the time of the insulin infusion. These ketones were being metabolized by the brain. The crazy thing is, not even the lowest level of glucose reached in these kinds of studies. This earlier study, published in 1972, saw subjects who, after a 50-day fast, leading to an average weight loss of 33 kilograms, so probably effective, received an intravenous injection of insulin, whereupon their glucose levels dropped to about 0.6 millimoles a litre. The interesting thing from this graph here, however, is that there appears to be very little glucose uptake from the blood. Compare the red line, which represents arterial blood delivering glucose to the tissues, and the blue line shows venous blood returning from the tissue. You can see that very little glucose was extracted. In contrast, the amount of ketones being extracted was fairly significant, clearly demonstrating the use of ketones as a preferred fuel source. More recent research has confirmed this in the brain, finding that higher ketone levels result in reduced glucose metabolism, again suggesting that ketones are probably a preferred fuel source. Importantly, and with respect to therapeutic use of ketones, there is clear evidence that the increased use or the increase of ketones in our blood leads to an increased use in ketones by our brain, which is where a ketogenic diet comes in kind of handy. The fact is, if you're concussed while you are on a ketogenic diet, it's likely that the ketones in your blood will be able to supply your brain with energy, averting the energy crisis that contributes to the second wave of damage. There's increasing clinical evidence for the use of ketogenic diets in the insulin-resistant brain too. It's well known that the brains of subjects with dementia typically have a reduced capacity for glucose metabolism of about 25%, and this is due to insulin resistance. That's what underscores the reduction in brain metabolism that we see in a lot of neurodegenerative diseases. This is why studies finding that a ketogenic diet could increase the overall brain metabolism by 3 times in patients with Alzheimer's disease is hugely significant. The problem is, however, that it can take several days for a ketogenic diet to reach therapeutic levels of ketones. This study, for example, found that a ketogenic diet could result in significant improvements in brain metabolism, but that it took 4 days for the ketones to be producing about 33% of the brain's energy. And if you're already not on a ketogenic diet when you get concussed, this 4 days is simply too long. Much of the second wave of damage will have already occurred long before you get to a therapeutic level of ketones. So then, what to do if you get concussed and you're not already on a ketogenic diet? Well, the stopgap here might just be supplemental ketones, which can achieve therapeutic levels of ketones in just 30 minutes. Now, when it comes to supplementing with ketones, we've really got three options: medium chain triglycerides, ketone salts, and ketone esters. The first of these, are medium chain triglycerides, while rapidly absorbed and converted to ketone bodies, are associated with significant, and I do mean that, significant gastrointestinal side effects, and they're probably not feasible in the real world. Ketone salts can achieve higher levels of ketones in the blood than the medium chain triglycerides, and they're somewhat better tolerated, but they still do have issues of gastrointestinal tolerability. And being salts, they also present a high mineral load, which can be problematic. But if you can tolerate them, then ketone salts are certainly worthy of consideration. Finally, we have ketone esters, which, depending on the dose, are able to achieve starvation level of ketones within just 30 minutes. And while they don't have the same gastrointestinal side effects of medium chain triglycerides or the ketone salts, by all accounts, they taste absolutely terrible. Not to miss the point that they're also quite expensive. Now, the other problem that we have, besides palatability and expense of ketone supplements, is their fairly rapid metabolism. So realistically, to maintain a therapeutic level of ketones would require dosing at least every 3 to 4 hours, which may be possible for a few days while waiting for therapeutic levels of ketones to be reached from a ketogenic diet, but it would be simply impractical to be done for any longer. And as yet, there have been no high-quality studies that have looked specifically at either ketogenic diets or ketone supplementations in the immediate post-concussive period. We do have this pilot study in which subjects with prolonged symptoms of concussion commenced a ketogenic diet and found some improvement in visual memory. But the fact is, we really need more studies to prove the benefit of this mechanistic science. The alternative to a nutritional approach to concussion management, however, is even more limited. Take this recent consensus document, which largely promotes a model of care that could be summarised as controlled activity progression, with no interventions that might meaningfully reduce damage or accelerate recovery recommended. Now, I speculate the poor efficacy of their treatments to be the reason for this medico-legal disclaimer you see on the bottom right of this document, advising that following this consensus statement for medical practitioners like myself does not protect you from a claim of malpractice. Perhaps them entertaining the possibility that concussion has not been proven to be a structural injury might have something to do with it. As an aside, putting this disclaimer on dietary guidelines would be fantastic, making clear to clinicians our responsibility to actually think for ourselves when reviewing the science that we use to base our treatments on. Now, on the background of there being very little in the way of mainstream treatments for concussion, I feel there are other nutritional considerations and supplemental factors worthy of consideration. Avoidance of processed foods being the lowest lying fruit. And this basically comes down to them containing sugar and seed oils. You see, both sugar and seed oils, through disturbance of the lipid raft, are able to induce insulin resistance. Lipid rafts are largely composed of cholesterol and another species of fat called a sphingolipid. And the composition of these fats in the lipid raft is essential for their structural stability. Insertion of other lipid species into the lipid raft can disrupt it. Now, the consumption of sugars can lead to the production of a waxy lipid called a ceramide, which absolutely can disrupt the lipid raft. It's also more than likely that a type of plant cholesterol different from mammalian cholesterol can also insert itself into lipid rafts. And it just so happens that seed oils are particularly rich in this type of fat, phytosterols. And so the answer to the age-old question, which is worse for insulin resistance, carbohydrates or seed oils? The answer is both. It just depends on the dose. So let's take a closer look at the mechanism. When we overconsume carbohydrates to excess, the liver will go through a process called de novo lipogenesis and produce saturated fat. And the most common saturated fat produced is called palmitate. Now, this is why high levels of the saturated fat palmitate in the blood are associated with diabetes, and why so many people incorrectly assume that that fat probably comes from the consumption of saturated fat and advise against saturated fat in the diet. In actual fact, this fat is produced by carbohydrate consumption. A diet rich in palmitate actually leads to reduced levels in the blood. And until doctors get their head around that, they're probably going to keep on recommending low saturated diets until kingdom come. Now, once you've produced the palmitate, it can then be converted into something called ceramide palmitate. And bam, there's the problem. This ceramide has been found in high concentrations in the lipid raft. It can enter the lipid raft and disrupt it, causing insulin resistance. And seed oils can disrupt the insulin signaling pathway through a near identical mechanism, except this time, instead of ceramides produced by the liver, it's the phytosterols, the fake form of plant cholesterol. Very similar to human cholesterol, it can be absorbed into the body, and as with ceramides, it can become assimilated into the lipid rafts. The fact is, both sugar and seed oils contribute to insulin resistance through a near identical mechanism. Now, at this point, I'd like to briefly discuss the oft-cited role of inflammation and hyperinsulinemia, or high insulin levels, in causing insulin resistance. This, in fact, is something I myself have previously preached. And it's easy to see how we came to this conclusion, that high insulin levels and high inflammation might cause insulin resistance. After all, we usually see them occur together. This paper from 1982 found high levels of insulin resistance in patients with burns. The problem is, this type of associational research fails to adequately control for a major confounder, high glucose levels, the same high glucose levels that lead to ceramide production and lipid raft disturbance. You see, when you have a stressful injury, we produce hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, which stimulate the production of glucose, the process of gluconeogenesis. And this has significant consequences, downstream consequences for insulin resistance, which is why this paper studying insulin resistance in burns patients really caught my attention. What made this study different was that some of the subjects in this study, these burns patients, also received a high-dose insulin infusion. Now, if indeed hyperinsulinemia was a causal factor in insulin resistance, it should be obvious in these subjects their insulin resistance should be off the scale. Except it wasn't. In actual fact, those subjects who were infused with high-dose insulin were found to have lower levels of insulin resistance. The major difference between these two groups was their glucose levels. The insulin infusion being delivered in an intensive care setting and continuously controlled effectively controlled their glucose levels. Something which I believe resulted in a reduced production of ceramides, that ceramide palmitate, with a resultant reduction in disturbance of the lipid raft. The fact is, I have not found any research demonstrating high levels of insulin cause insulin resistance which adequately control for glucose levels. Of course, moving on, the brain requires several other nutrients, multiple nutrients for optimal function, which are often deficient on processed food diets. Take iron, for example. It's a necessary cofactor for the production of two enzymes that are essential for the production of dopamine and serotonin. This is probably why iron supplementation has been shown by several randomized controlled trials to result in an increase in intelligence. We also need to ensure that not only do we get the right nutrients, but we get them in the right form. Omega-3 fats, for example, come in both plant and animal forms, but it's only the animal form which has been proven to increase IQ in high-quality randomised controlled trials. We also have creatine, which is only found in foods containing animal flesh, like meat and fish. It's able to increase ATP levels, which is the energy currency of the body, and is also present in significant quantities in the brain. And more than 12 studies have found creatine supplementation to improve cognitive function. Furthermore, creatine shows promise as a treatment for prolonged symptoms after concussion. This was a small-scale randomised controlled trial comparing the supplementation of high-dose creatine to placebo over 6 months in head-injured patients. And the results were quite striking. Compare the reduction in headaches between control subjects, represented by the black bar, to the supplemented cases in the white bar. We saw similar improvements in dizziness and fatigue, very promising results, despite it being a delayed intervention. We should also consider anti-nutrient factors in several plant foods, which may prevent you from absorbing essential nutrients. Here you can see that zinc, a nutrient essential for brain function, is well absorbed from a meal of oysters. Look what happens when the same meal of oysters is combined with black beans, a reduction in absorption of more than 2/3. What about the same oyster meal combined with corn tortillas? You see, getting enough nutrients for your brain is often not so much about what you do eat as what you don't. Consuming legumes for iron, as is often recommended too, really doesn't make any sense when you consider that you can only consume 1 to 2% of the iron they contain. And at the same time, they contain several other anti-nutrients, limiting your absorption of multiple other nutrients. What about cruciferous vegetables, often consumed in abundance on low-carb diets? Well, they contain something called glucosinolates that can block the absorption of iodine, which is also happens to be very important for brain development. The fact is, plants don't provide all the nutrients a brain needs and can block absorption of nutrients from other foods. Let's move on from diet. So given the role of oxidative stress in the second wave of damage following concussion, there may be a role for antioxidant supplements in the post-concussion phase. Now, one antioxidant which has been studied for this purpose is N-acetylcysteine. This study was a randomised controlled trial, a double-blinded, of US military service members who suffered mild head injuries after exposure to improvised explosive devices. Subjects were given either a placebo or N-acetylcysteine. And this graph records the mean number of symptoms suffered by study participants, including headaches, memory loss, sleep disturbance, and dizziness. And while both groups improved, there was a clear benefit at day 7 for those subjects taking N-acetylcysteine. And given its excellent safety profile, it's certainly worthy of consideration in the early treatment of concussion. Now, before I finish, I'd like to touch on 2 commonly overlooked sources of structural injury associated with concussion, which can contribute significantly to injury. The first involves the pituitary gland, buried deep in the brain. The pituitary gland releases several hormones important for a wide array of physiological functions and sits at the end of a stalk called the infundibulum. Being ensconced within a bony chamber, the freedom of movement permitted by being on the end of this stalk makes the pituitary gland particularly vulnerable to injury, where it can swing around and bash into the bone. Indeed, repetitive head impacts and traumatic brain injury can result in disturbance of the pituitary gland, known as post-traumatic hypopituitarism. The fact is, it's been known for more than 100 years, with the first article describing this phenomenon of pituitary dysfunction following head injury was published in 1918. What might surprise you, however, is that the extent of problems which can arise from this dysfunction. You see, the pituitary gland secretes 8 major hormones, all of which may be affected. including growth hormone, thyroid hormone, cortisol, and the sex hormones. A study on retired boxers, for example, found that 47% had a growth hormone deficiency. And even soccer players have been shown to be at risk. The fact is, post-traumatic hypopituitarism is frequently overlooked as a source of chronic symptoms in athletes and is something that should always be considered. The second commonly overlooked structural injury associated with head trauma, which can result in chronic headaches. The brain and spinal cord are bathed in a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid, which is contained within a membrane that surrounds the spinal cord. With a whiplash injury, which commonly occurs with head trauma, small bony spurs on the back of degenerate bones and discs in the neck, also a common consequence of recurrent head impacts, may actually puncture this membrane around the spinal cord, resulting in a small leak. This leak can cause headaches, which is typically what we call postural. It's much worse when you stand up and it gets better when you lie down. And while uncommon, this type of headache is absolutely debilitating, and a simple injection of blood to the outside of the punctured membrane may help seal the leak, with a success rate of up to 87%. In closing, in the absence of effective treatments for concussion, we should encourage athletes in contact sports to adopt ketogenic diets. And if not, we should at least ensure they're on nutrient-dense diets with real food, low in seed oils and low in sugars. There's also likely to be a role for supplements ranging from ketones, for those not on ketogenic diets, to creatine monohydrate and antioxidant supplements. Thanks for listening.